The dilemma of statesmanship is that when your scope for action is greatest, your knowledge is at a minimum.
September 1st, 1939. Hitler attacks Poland. This is the beginning of the Second World War. It will last for 6 years, and it will change the world more than any war before. The Schleswig-Holstein, a German warship, fires the first shots of the war. The shots are aimed at Polish fortifications close to Danzig. At the same time, German troops are swarming across the Polish border. The Germans use a new military tactic soon to be known as blitzkrieg. A fighting machine such as the world has never seen before goes into action. The Air Force carries the war deep into the hinterland. The Poles are the very first in this war to experience the horrors of air warfare. Hitler has given the order to invade Poland. On September the 3rd, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany.
When the war broke out at the beginning of September 1939, it was one of the most personal and idiosyncratic wars that had ever occurred. Hitler had told the German generals a year and a half earlier that he was determined to have a war while he was still a young man, and this actually dominated his policies more than any rational analysis of costs and benefits. Curiously enough, the result of World War I had left Germany strategically stronger than it was before World War I. Before World War I, Germany was surrounded on every front by major countries and could therefore expand only by attacking a major country and thereby provoking a general war. As a result of the Treaty of Versailles and Treaty of Saint-Germain, Germany was surrounded by a host of little countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, backed up by Hungary, Romania, none of which were in a position to resist Germany alone. Germany was bound to become economically and politically the dominant country in Eastern Europe. It was Hitler's impatience and Hitler's insistence on achieving by military means what the geopolitical situation would have made possible to achieve by political means.
This is how the First World War ended. Peace is welcomed by the people in the streets. Paris, 1919. The world's leading politicians gather in Versailles, statesmen of the nations that have won the First World War. They are about to sign a peace treaty with defeated Germany and to impose a new order on the world. But each of the victors has a different concept of what this order should be. The French Prime Minister Clemenceau arrives. His firm intention is to eliminate Germany as a major military power once and for all. The British Premier Lloyd George, accompanied by his wife. His main interest is the balance of power in Europe, and therefore not even an ally like France should become too strong. The Italian Prime Minister Orlando demands compensation for Italy's war effort. The American President Woodrow Wilson, also accompanied by his wife. Wilson's concept envisages that each nation should be entitled to its own state in keeping with the principle of self-determination, and no nation should rule over another nation. At the conference, the Allies find it very hard to resolve their differences. This results in compromises. The French objective to weaken an all-powerful Germany is only partially fulfilled. Germany has to give up some of its territories, has to pay reparations, and its army is drastically reduced. In substance, however, Germany remains intact. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the other hand, will be dismantled. The people of Paris celebrate peace, celebrate above all the four statesmen who are about to give Europe a completely new order. From left to right, the Briton Lloyd George, the Italian Orlando, the Frenchman Clemenceau, and the American President Wilson. But the peace is made without the assent of the losers. The German Foreign Minister Brockdorff-Rantzau leaves the conference under protest. Finally, the peace terms are dictated to the Germans in Versailles and to the Austrians in Saint-Germain. From now on, these will be known as the Treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. One major European power remains excluded altogether: Soviet Russia.
The problem with the Treaty of Versailles was that two of the historic European countries, the Soviet Union and Germany, had no interest in maintaining the settlement, and in fact, many incentives to overthrow it. And another of the historic European countries, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, disappeared completely. The purpose of the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was to permit each of the nationalities that comprised the empire to determine its own fate. And that was a very laudable objective in the abstract.
And so, with Wilson's help, new states were born. In Prague, the Czech population is celebrating the birth of the independent Republic of Czechoslovakia. The insignia of the Habsburg Empire are destroyed, the German shop signs taken down. A new republic is declared, a national home for Czechs and the Slovaks. But millions of Germans, Hungarians, and Poles will also have to live within the Czechoslovakian state, and soon they, in their turn, will claim their right to self-determination. Revolution also in Budapest. The Hungarians claim their independence and finally declare Hungary a democratic republic. After the proclamation of the new state, a gypsy band strikes up the Marseillaise. Hungary has to cede large areas to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Red flags in Warsaw, Lublin, and Krakow. Poland is resurrected. Until now divided between Germany, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Paris treaties put the three parts of Poland back together again. In Vienna, too, the Republic proclaimed. A republic even weaker than all the others. For the shrunken state of Austria no longer considers itself viable. Austria's parliamentarians therefore demand immediate unification with Germany according to President Wilson's principle of self-determination. But since such a union would strengthen Germany, it is denied. In place of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 5 new states have come into existence.
So as a matter of fact, if one counted Hungarians in Romania, Poles in Czechoslovakia, Germans in Czechoslovakia and in other parts of Eastern Europe, Austrians in northern Italy, or especially in the Tyrol. When considered all of these nationalities, there were probably as many nationalities living under foreign rule in the name of self-determination as had lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
This is how Europe looked before World War I. A balance of power existed between the big states. The Paris Treaty destroyed this balance. At the territorial expense of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia, all the new small states emerge, from Finland in the north to Yugoslavia in the south. Germany is not willing to recognize the new frontiers in the east.
So one could argue about the Treaty of Versailles as far as Germany is concerned. It was too severe to have Germany accept the legitimacy of the settlement, but not severe enough to keep Germany from challenging the settlement. Now, among the European countries, this was probably understood by the French, who had dealt with Germany for 300 years. Britain might have gone along with France, but the United States had a different view. The United States' view was that the balance of power was in itself evil. Wilson traveled around Europe and asserted in the United States that we would not go back, we Americans would not go back to the outdated concept of the balance of power, that we were going to base the new international order on the consent of the people.
Wilson is visiting the capitals of the Allied powers. Here, he is received by France's President Poincaré in Paris. The president is greeted warmly by the French. Wilson has come to convince France of his concept of a new world order. Peace should be ensured not by military power, but for the first time by an international organization, by a league of all nations. The enthusiasm of the people contrasts sharply with the skepticism of the statesmen, especially in Paris, at whose gates the German army had stood so recently. The French accept the concept of a League of Nations, but they prefer to rely on their own military strength. When Wilson leaves France, it is with feeling that he's been revered and honored, but not really understood. Wilson travels from capital to capital. In Rome, the American president is welcomed by the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel, and jubilant crowds wherever he appears. The Secret Service men on their bicycles can afford to take it easy. In Italy's streets, Wilson encounters nothing but enthusiasm. Among the political leaders and the military, however, he meets with nothing but skepticism. The politicians accord Wilson his personal triumph, but they reckon that Italy's new borders will be better protected by a strong army than by Wilson's League of Nations. Even in the United States, Wilson finds no support for his plans. The American Congress turns his proposals down in spite of all the jubilation in Europe.
The concept of the League of Nations, introduced by the United States, was a new idea. That had not existed in that form before. And it was based on three assumptions. One, that the threat to peace was always unambiguous. Second, that every nation had an equal interest in preserving the peace. And third, that every nation would come to the same conclusion about the methods to preserve the peace. This turned out to be quite incorrect. Wilson proposed something that his own people were never going to fulfill, and for which there is no evidence that it has ever worked in human history. So in the end, the balance of power as it emerged from the Treaty of Versailles depended entirely on the role of France. And precisely because France knew that Germany was highly dissatisfied with the agreement, but not so weak permanently as to not to be able to challenge it at some moment, France felt that it needed absolute security guarantees.
One of these guarantees is the occupation of the Rhineland, the German territories on the left bank of the Rhine. Using the Rhineland as a springboard, the French army should be able any time to march on Berlin. Allied troops occupied the Rhineland. Among the first, French cavalry. On the right bank of the Rhine, too, 4 Allied bridgeheads are established. Control of all roads and railways and the future demilitarization of the Rhineland serve as a pledge that Germany will honor all conditions of the Versailles Treaty. Together with the French, British and other Allied troops move into the Rhineland. The British set up their own General Headquarters, British Army of the Rhine, in Cologne. British soldiers serve as sentries on the banks of the river. So it is not only the French that watch over the observance of the Versailles Treaty by Germany, Americans are also present and run their own little navy on the Rhine. The American soldiers see themselves as a peacekeeping force. At the same time, they try to be helpful. American soldiers escort food deliveries by German farmers to the starving cities. Handing out candy, the Americans assume popular with the children. The U.S. Congress dispatches some of its members on tours of inspection. The Congress would like to see the American troops brought back home, but they do understand the French motives for the occupation of the Rhineland.
It was clear that the only manner in which the Versailles settlement, or the Saint-Germain settlement, could be maintained in Eastern Europe would be if France was prepared to use military force at the first sign of challenge. And that challenge, in turn, had two components. One, as part of the Versailles settlement, the Rhineland was a hostage for France because France would move in there if Germany began military operations in the east. And secondly, of course, it meant that France would be much stronger. It was required that France would be so much stronger than Germany.
In order to weaken Germany, the German arms industry is demolished. The submarine shipyards are blown up. Some warships are turned over to the Allies, others scuttled. Never again must Germany be allowed to build up a powerful navy. Gun turrets are dismantled, the gun barrels sawn to pieces. This goes for the field artillery too. All its guns are turned into scrap metal. This scrap metal turns out to be exceptionally valuable, however. What's left of the German steel industry is capable of transforming scrap into first-class steel in their Siemens Martin furnaces. The German steel industry is now producing the goods that Germany must send to France as reparation. The state pays for this production, which is supposed to weaken the German economy, but which in fact is strengthening it. For the factories are working, ensuring employment and profits, money which will be reinvested in new machinery. Among many other goods, Germany has to deliver railroad cars and locomotives as part of the reparations. Germany experiences a galloping inflation that drains the buying power of the people, but the inflation enables the state to pay off the internal war debts very quickly. For foreigners, it becomes highly profitable to invest in Germany's industry. German goods are cheap, and that leads to high exports. Thus, the reparation system does not substantially weaken Germany, but it succeeds in weakening France.
The goods that were delivered from Germany to France had the practical consequence of reducing the demand on the output of French industry and therefore helped to increase French unemployment and discourage the modernization of French industry because they could not compete with goods that were delivered for nothing. At the same time, the delivery of goods outside of Germany stimulated inflation, which for a while had terrible consequences inside Germany, but also made it easy to consolidate the industries and modernize them. The demand for expropriation and for dismantling of industries was another factor that had the paradoxical and unintended consequence of enabling Germany to modernize its industry by replacing the industries that it had to deliver to the victor nations. So the total impact of the reparation system may well have been to modernize German industry, to improve the long-term German economic position, and, if anything, to weaken the economic position of France and to a lesser extent of Britain.
A first wave of unemployment spills across Great Britain and France. Protest marches in London. The demonstrators demand work in return for their suffering in the trenches. They demand the fruits of their victory in the Great War. Instead, Britain still has to pay for the war with money that would be desperately needed for investments. The situation in France is even worse. Not only must the French pay for their own war damages, they too have to repay their war debts. The social unrest destabilizes the political system and brings about one government crisis after another. The third victor nation, Italy, finds itself in the midst of political upheaval. A new movement mobilizes the masses, fascism. The fascists promise work and social justice, and in 1922, they stage a march that converges on Rome from all corners of Italy. Marching on Rome armed with clubs, the black shirts want to bring down the democratic government. The fascists look on themselves as a counterforce to left radicalism, saving Italy from communism. Leader of the Italian fascists is Benito Mussolini. His march on Rome succeeds. Democracy capitulates. From now on, Mussolini will rule Italy. He becomes Italy's leader, the Duce, a model for many rightist movements in Europe. Mussolini's later alliance with Hitler will decisively influence the course of World War II.
Well, in the end, Mussolini turned out to be not exactly the model for Hitler. Mussolini was, of course, a authoritarian, maybe even a totalitarian ruler. But he governed in a country in which historically the authority of the government is mitigated by the skepticism of the population, and where one does not have this concept of absolute obedience that was elaborated in, for example, Germany under Prussian leadership.
Russia, at the same time, experiences first revolution, then civil war, followed by expropriation and collectivization under the red banner of communism. The communists see themselves as the liberators of mankind from need and suppression. And to achieve these goals, they impose a new dictatorship. Famine follows on the heels of mass collectivization. But a great effort is also made to industrialize Russia and to establish the first socialist society. A model for the whole world, the communists proclaim. In the West, this is understood as a war cry, as a threat. This is Joseph Stalin, Lenin's successor, watching his communists as they march for world revolution. But for the moment, Stalin has his hands full stabilizing his own rule in Russia. Stalin's dictatorship frightens the West even more and leads to greater isolation of the Soviet Union in the world.
To begin with, the Soviet Union was considered outside the system. So historic Russia was not part of the balance of power. It was considered ideologically outside the system, and it was in reality so weak that it could no longer act as a balancer, even less so since nobody wanted to deal with it. And precisely because France knew, one, that its pre-war ally, Russia, was no longer part of the balance, the French began to construct the Maginot Line, which advertised that in case of war, France would go on the defensive in the West. That was another way of saying that if Germany attacked France's allies in the East, it would be able to destroy them without French intervention.
The Maginot Line. Along the entire border between their country and Germany, the French have built fortifications such as the world has never seen before. The underground bunkers are connected to each other by little railways. These fortifications are the French answer to the bloody battles of World War I, in which over 1 million young Frenchmen lost their lives. These bunkers, bristling with guns, are intended to prevent any future German army from attacking France. On the other hand, it hinders any French forward strategy aimed at Germany. The guns are loaded automatically and aimed by periscopes. The gun turrets are raised hydraulically. An imposing fortress, and yet an admission of weakness.
The whole weight of preserving the peace was thrown on a country that, in proportion to its population, had suffered the greatest casualties and had been in many ways most demoralized by the war, namely France. The United States withdrew from the settlement, and Britain withdrew into its traditional posture, not recognizing that politically and psychologically, France alone could not preserve the European peace. France would have therefore liked to impose harsher terms so long as it could not get an American and British military guarantee. And for much of the 20s, France was oscillating between an attempt to assure its security by physical means and half-hearted attempts to come to some settlement with Germany, and it managed to fall between all schools.
France's Foreign Minister Aristide Briand tries to forge a new relationship between France and Germany. In Gustav Stresemann, Germany's new foreign minister, he finds an understanding partner. They meet at Locarno in Switzerland and sign a treaty which will help to reorganize the reparation system and is intended to placate German grievances. The treaty should reassure France that the Germans will not try to revise the frontiers drawn at Versailles. But when, by the end of the conference, the statesmen pose for the photographers, the French have only partially succeeded in Locarno. Stresemann had guaranteed the new French frontiers with Germany, but is not ready to give a similar guarantee on the eastern frontiers of Germany.
The Treaty of Locarno, in which Germany accepted the western frontiers and guaranteed the western frontiers as they were drawn by the Treaty of Versailles. It was already a startling concept that the Treaty of Versailles was not enough to guarantee the frontiers, that it required an additional guarantee, which in itself was an attack on the legitimacy of the treaty. But Germany would not give the same guarantee for its eastern frontiers. And the Western countries accepted two categories of frontiers, one that were assured by the Treaty of Locarno, and the others that were not.
America's role at that time turns out to be decisive. New York in the 20s has become the center of world finance. American banks have loaned England and France the money for the war. Germany, money for its economic recovery. Money that has to be paid back, however. On the New York docks, shipments are unloaded with some of the repayments from Western Europe to the United States. Crates filled with gold bars. The war has cost enormous sums of money, costs that have weakened all European nations. This has left the United States economically and financially the leading power in the world. America experiences a unique economic boom. On Wall Street, the stock exchange is pushed sky high by speculation such as never before. In October 1929 comes the great crash. The market is flooded by shares, prices plummet, billions are lost. As a result, thousands of factories the world over are forced to close down, millions lose their jobs.
The reactions of governments to the crisis was protectionism, so that the tendency was to encapsulate each of these economies in their own markets. That was one element. The second element was that according to traditional theory, when there was a recession, the state should reduce its expenditures austerity would be the remedy by which capital would gradually be formed again. But all of this had the consequence of reducing demand even more and turning recessions into deep depressions. That, on top of the casualties that had been suffered in World War I, produced a demoralization of almost all of the body politics, and it contributed to the indecisiveness of democracies in the 1930s.
Unemployed line up in New York to get a dime from charity or a cup of soup. Hunger lines, they are called. These men are willing to work for $1 a week. $1 a week they have written on their hats, and they carry sandwich boards showing their professions. The farmers go on strike since they can't get reasonable prices for their products. The needy try to grab what they can of these products. Misery leads to confrontations with the law all over the world. Tear gas has become a routine expedient for the police in their confrontation with unruly workers. In Germany, they already do battle in the streets. Mass unemployment strengthens the communists and the Nazis. They fight each other in the streets while the police become more and more impotent. People are frightened by the unrest and cry out for law and order. Joseph Goebbels, head of Nazi propaganda, promises law and order if Hitler comes to power. By now, Nazi stormtroopers begin to dominate the streets. Bring Hitler to power, they demand. Under his leadership, they promise, there will be work for everyone. And Hitler will tear up the unjust peace treaty of Versailles too. There he is, Adolf Hitler, who promises to make Germany great and powerful once more. He draws huge crowds who believe that he will overcome unemployment and class war, though Hitler himself propagates hatred and conflict.
Sie können uns meinetwegen töten, kapitulieren werden wir nicht.
Many people are impressed by his aggressive attitude. In 1932, Hitler wins 1/3 of the overall vote. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appoints Hitler as chancellor. At first, Hitler heads a coalition of Nazis and right-wingers. His vice-chancellor is Franz von Papen. Hermann Goering, on the left in our picture, is Hitler's close supporter and companion. To the outside world, it is a democratic government. In reality, power, also in Germany, is already in the hands of the marchers. Hitler cannot yet rely on soldiers, but he can rely on his SR and SS battalions. With their help, Hitler smashes the democracy in Germany and promises to abolish the Versailles Peace Treaty. And he is determined to destroy the Jews. War and destruction are written on his banners.
When Hitler came to power, one could not know whether he meant what he said. As late as 1936, if one goes through British statements at the time, many British leaders took the public view that Hitler was really only responding to a well-established grievance, and that once that was satisfied, he would become a normal member of the international community. It was not historically considered a part of European diplomacy that nations would make their diplomatic contacts depend on the domestic structure of another country, provided that other country conducted a moderate and balanced foreign policy.
Hitler has no intention of being moderate. He is striving for total power. Hitler appeals to his stormtroopers. Now that we have won power in Germany, we shall have to win the German people.
Die Macht haben wir nun in Deutschland gewonnen. Nun gilt es, das deutsche Volk zu gewinnen.
Shortly after this, the Reichstag, the German parliament, goes up in flames. Hitler uses the opportunity to arrest political opponents and to put an end to the rule of law. The first concentration camps are set up. They are soon packed with adversaries of the regime. Political leaders, intellectuals, or just people who oppose the Nazis. All of them prisoners now. Jews are declared enemies of the people. Their shops are smeared, and the Nazis call for a boycott. Germans, do not buy from Jews. For the moment, it is mass terror. In a few years, it will be mass murder. Many are leaving the country now. Albert Einstein is one of the first to seek refuge from Hitler Germany. Many more are to follow. Germany's spiritual elite is emigrating. Einstein finds asylum in the United States. Freedom has died in Germany, he declares.
Without such freedom, there would have been no Shakespeare, no Goethe, no Newton, no Faraday, no Pasteur, and no Lister.
The reason for the lack of reaction of the Western countries is that the concept that human rights had to be vindicated by foreign policy had in fact not yet been established. I lived in Germany at the time. I had no doubt that we were dealing with a maniacal personality. But for people further away, it was not so self-evident. But even the racist views were done for domestic consumption, or whether he would, in fact, pursue them. One of the results of this blindness was that the democracies were severely punished by being subjected to some of the same treatment themselves when it broke out of its boundaries.
At the same time, in the United States, in March 1933, a new president takes office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt promises to overcome the economic crisis through an extensive government program, the New Deal. It is Roosevelt who will become one of the strongest adversaries of Hitler. However, in 1933, when he takes office, not Europe, but Asia is on his mind. At the inaugural parade, the troops are led by a general named Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief Staff, seen here on horseback. The general joins the president on the grandstand. A few years later, MacArthur will fight the war against Japan. The confrontation in the Pacific is already impending.
And operationally, it is probably true that without ever stating it explicitly, the United States was in fact conducting a kind of balance of power policy in Asia. Now, the practical result of a balance of power policy in Asia was to attempt to preserve the integrity of China and to prevent Japanese expansion. Then the Japanese actions fitted better into the American concept of intolerable international behavior than the early Nazi actions. The early Nazi actions were primarily aimed at domestic minorities of German nationality and at undoing the effects or the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. On the other hand, the Japanese actually invaded neighboring countries. They were therefore violating the concept of collective security as it was understood in the United States.
Japan had grown into a formidable military power. In World War I, Japan fought together with the Allies against Germany. It belongs to the victor nations. Now, it is striving to become the dominant power in Eastern Asia. Emperor Hirohito, a man who, godlike, enjoys the unqualified devotion of his subjects. In 1931, Japanese troops occupy all of Manchuria, a part of China. With the invasion of Manchuria, Japan is the first power to break the post-war peace settlement. China's leader, Marshal Chiang Kai-shek, attempts to mobilize Chinese resistance against Japan. The Japanese troops continue their advance beyond Manchuria into northern China. Korea, occupied by Japan since 1905, serves as a bridgehead on the mainland. Now Manchuria is made a Japanese satellite state, and it is from here that the Japanese start to expand into China. In 1937, with a new thrust, they reach Peking and Shanghai.
Now, the actual decision to oppose Japan developed only gradually under the impact of an additional Japanese advance into northern China from Manchuria and the apparent attempt to dominate all of China, and this was compounded by extraordinary atrocities committed by the Japanese armies in China. All of this created a combination of feeling of indignation on moral grounds, and I suppose some recognition that a Japan dominating all of Asia and having a large sea power would be in time a threat to the United States.
Shanghai. There are European enclaves in Shanghai with American participation. Lying at anchor in the harbor is the American cruiser Augusta as a demonstration of America's power. But the Augusta has also come to evacuate American women and children. They are brought to safety. Japanese attack on the city seems to be imminent. And it duly comes from the air. The Japanese Air Force drops its bombs indiscriminately on the civilian population. Pictures like these stir up public opinion both in the United States and in Europe. Japan, a member of the League of Nations, had turned against a fellow member, China, and the Japanese actions provoked the United States.
With Japan, it was theoretically possible to placate it by giving it a free hand in China and maybe in Southeast Asia. But this was so much against the American perceptions of the time, and for that matter, so much against American interests, to permit Japan to dominate China and all the rest of Asia, that resistance was inevitable.
Geneva, seat of the League of Nations. Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, has come to accuse another aggressor. His country has been attacked by Mussolini's Italy in 1935. Haile Selassie appeals to the League of Nations for help. Italian journalists try to disturb the emperor's speech and have to be forcefully removed from the press section of the balcony. The emperor lodges his complaint, and the assembly condemns Mussolini's attack on Ethiopia. The Western powers oppose Mussolini's growing influence in Africa and the Mediterranean.
The League has two main tasks. First,
The British delegate Anthony Eden asks for sanctions to be imposed on Italy. Thus, the cooperation between the Western powers and Italy, dating from the First World War, is virtually terminated.
and it is by the League's effectiveness in realizing this aim that the League will be judged.
The war in Ethiopia lasts for 7 months. Then Italian troops march into Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital. These are still the time's colonial empires. Colonies are a prerequisite of any major power. Mussolini wants Italy to be a major power. The Italian Victory Parade. Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was then called, was one of the very few countries in Africa that had never been made a colony. Now Italian arms have defeated this independent black state. Marshal Pietro Badoglio has won the war in Ethiopia, and as victor, he is cheered on his return to Rome. In 1943, it will be the same Marshal Badoglio who will topple Mussolini and lead Italy back to the Allied fold. Now, however, his victory in Ethiopia earns Mussolini the cheers of the crowd. Under Mussolini's leadership, Italy seems to be well on the way to becoming a major power in spite of all the sanctions imposed by the League of Nations.
And so the League of Nations passed sanctions, but so reluctantly and so ambivalently and ambiguously that they had no major effect on Italy. The only sanction that might have had an effect, an oil embargo, was deliberately not imposed because it was feared that Italy would go to war against Britain and France if that happened, which in retrospect appears absurd. Nevertheless, the confrontation between Britain and to a lesser extent France over the issue of Ethiopia with Italy created the objective condition in which Italy felt that it needed European support and was given it by Hitler. And it was the beginning of the Berlin-Rome axis.
The first meeting between Hitler and Mussolini had taken place in 1934 in Venice. Mussolini still very much in the pose of the more powerful of the two, the leader of a country which belongs to the victor nations of World War I. Hitler eager to engage Italy's sympathies. Germany still disarmed, Italy in possession of a strong army and navy. Much has changed since this meeting in Venice. Hitler has reintroduced general conscription, and by rearming Germany has broken the Versailles Treaty. And nothing has happened in consequence. Hitler displays first tanks and Air Force squadrons of his armed forces in full view of the public. The tanks and planes demonstrate how they will combine to break any enemy resistance. Hitler is on the point of challenging the Western powers once again. March 7th, 1936, German troops cross the Rhine and march into Cologne. The Rhineland, after the Allied occupation forces had left, was supposed to remain militarized. Hitler dares to reoccupy it.
France took the view that it could resist only with full mobilization. It would not do full mobilization without Britain. Britain urged conciliation and negotiation. And it wasn't clear that Hitler would not be satisfied with simply asserting German sovereignty over, after all, German territory. Once that had happened, the Rhineland was no longer a hostage. And that, combined with the French Maginot Line, almost assured that if a crisis developed in the East, France would not be in a position to help the countries of Eastern Europe. The result was that Italy moved away from previous friendship towards the Western countries and was no longer prepared to run the risk that would be involved in ensuring the neutrality of Austria.
The Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg on a visit to Mussolini in Florence. Italy has acted as a protective power for Austria. Mussolini now relinquishes this role. He advises Schuschnigg to come to terms with Hitler. Mussolini thereby opens Hitler the way to Austria and to Southeast Europe. Mussolini's airplane is waiting. The farewell in Florence seems to be symbolic. Mussolini has slipped into a pilot's outfit, and he has strapped on a parachute. Mussolini takes a leap off, leaving Austria in the lurch. This was the situation up till now. France allied to Poland and Czechoslovakia. Austria's independence guarded by Italy. Now Italy becomes Germany's friend and ceases to protect Austria. An invitation to Hitler to advance into the vacuum.
On two previous occasions, right at the end of World War I, and then again in 1931, there was a specific prohibition against Austria joining Germany, although what would be done if they joined was never spelled out. It again reflects the fundamental imbalance of the Western democracies. On the one hand, Austria was not offered a military alliance as Czechoslovakia and Poland were, and as logically Austria should have been, to warn Germany that an annexation of Austria would lead to a general conflict.
On March the 12th, 1938, Hitler's air force appears over Vienna. The military occupation of Austria by German troops has begun. Austrian Nazis take over power. Police loyal to the government are disarmed. The formerly illegal Nazis arm themselves and begin arresting thousands of political opponents even before the German troops arrive. The German troops reach Vienna, and hard on their heels comes Adolf Hitler. Hitler is enthusiastically welcomed by many Austrians. For years, their dream had been the Anschluss, unification with Germany. Hitler now fulfills this dream, and the Anschluss is welcomed not only by the Nazis. Hitler himself is surprised by the jubilant acceptance of what, after all, is a forceful annexation in breach of international treaties. Hitler had feared that an invasion of Austria would meet with opposition from the West. But nothing happened. Hitler had risked everything again, and again he had won. From now on, he will risk even more.
Austria was taken over in a sort of a coup, but also with great popular enthusiasm. And the Western democracies didn't believe that their security was directly affected, even though the strategic situation of Austria in the hands of a major country opened the road to Central Europe.
With the annexation of Austria, the whole western part of Czechoslovakia is now encircled by the German armies. In Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, the reaction is one of alarm. From the Hradčín castle, President Edvard Beneš orders the Czech army to stand by. The Czechs have erected a close net of fortifications all along their borders. Military reinforcements now move into their defensive positions. Hitler promptly lays claim to the German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia, to the Sudetenland. A voluntary Sudeten German corps, armed in Germany, crosses the border to fight the Czech forces, thereby creating an excuse for German intervention. The British government sends Lord Runciman on a fact-finding mission to Czechoslovakia. When Runciman returns to London, he is inclined to acknowledge the German claim. 3.5 million Germans are living in Czechoslovakia, and England's Prime Minister Chamberlain asks himself whether it's worthwhile going to war for Czechoslovakia.
Neville Chamberlain said about Czechoslovakia, how strange it is that we might have to fight a war for a distant country about which we know nothing. This was said by a British statesman, a leader of a country that had fought 3 times in Afghanistan to prevent Russian domination of Afghanistan at the turn of the century.
Chamberlain decides to take a drastic step. He flies to Germany to see Hitler.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
It is a long way. Hitler wasn't prepared to meet the 70-year-old premier halfway. He receives him in his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. The greeting is a frosty one. What Hitler really wants is the destruction of the whole of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain is only prepared to agree to surrender the German-speaking territories.
I will only say this. I trust that all concerned will continue their efforts to solve the Czechoslovak problem peacefully, because on that turns the peace of Europe in our time.
After 2 meetings with Hitler, the Prime Minister is no longer optimistic. Digging starts in London. In all the parks, shelters are built as protection against air raids. Great Britain appears to be prepared to meet Hitler's challenge. Gas masks are distributed to young and old. Air raid wardens even celebrate a marriage wearing gas masks. And the newlyweds leave in a gas school bus for their honeymoon. The French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and Foreign Minister Bonnet come to London for an emergency meeting. They are greeted by Chamberlain and Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Secretary. The meeting is called in order to decide how to deal with Hitler. In the streets, demonstrators demand a strong stand for Czechoslovakia. In this troubled atmosphere, the French and the British come together at 10 Downing Street.
The dilemma of statesmanship is that when your scope for action is greatest, your knowledge is at a minimum. When your knowledge is greatest, the scope for creative action has disappeared. Hitler still was in a position to claim that all he wanted was to implement the principle of self-determination that Americans too had advocated, especially had advocated at the time of the Treaty of Versailles. And there was no doubt that the German population of Czechoslovakia, of the territories that were occupied by the Germans in 1938 after Munich,